Rebel Yvella. She is Lady Yvella, capable of changing her appearance until she is unrecognizable. The girl used this ability to work as a reporter under the pseudonym Belle. Some time ago, Viscount Ybell lost his entire fortune gambling, which led her to this life. Only Roland remained. Her only hope in this life, her wonderful and gentle fiancé. She believed with all her heart that marriage to him would bring her only happiness. But one day, disguised as someone else, she found her fiancé in the presence of another lady. And that broke her heart. In the end, Rebel realized how wrong she had been, and at that moment, when this whirlwind of life enveloped her, her whole life took a 180-degree turn. She showed up at a secret bar where the rule was that everything that happened in the bar stayed in the bar forever and masks were mandatory. The bartender noticed the visitor's condition and offered her a cocktail that promised to make her forget all her sorrows. But after the first glass came the second and then another, and the employee didn't have time to realize that the lady had drunk an incredible amount of alcohol. Nothing seemed to help, so she went to the bar and asked for something stronger to completely forget that night. The lady was already drunk, and that's why she didn't notice another visitor in front of her and accidentally brushed against him, apologizing only to slip as she moved away and almost fall, if not for the other visitor who caught her in time helping her up. The man returned silently to the bar, and the heroine noticed that he had caught her very elegantly, but didn't even seem to care how she felt. Sensing his coldness, she decided to start a conversation, so she moved closer, and told him that from that day on, she was like a free bird, since her fiancé was cheating on her with another woman. At that moment, she was shocked, thinking she couldn't sink any lower. She was sitting there, complaining to a stranger who seemed to show no interest at all. To her surprise, he laughed, which encouraged the lady, so she continued the conversation, stating that it was hard to believe such men even existed. In an instant, she realized that maybe she should meet another man, and immediately decided that the man in front of her would be her future husband, so she proposed to him. The stranger felt as if magic was flying around the unknown woman at that moment and saw an opportunity in it, so he accepted without hesitation. The next day, Rebel struggled out of bed with an unbearable headache. She remembered going to the secret bar, but how she got home was a mystery. But the fact that she was back was fine. She decided to read the newspaper to catch up on the latest news, when she suddenly saw a headline about her saying Lady Rebel had been caught in a lie and had lied about her engagement to Roland. In an interview, the man explained that it was all a silly joke, and after that event, Lady Rebel herself did not appear in public, and the exact wedding date between Lady Benissa and Roland was not revealed. This was written by a reporter unknown to her, and this upset her greatly since it was also written on the front page, and it was done just to humiliate her. Suddenly, a servant knocked on the door informing her that the Archduke had sent a reply and a marriage certificate. Seeing this, the lady tossed the paper aside, realizing it was a trick, since she hadn't even seen this Archduke in person, and if it were true, he would have appeared himself. A few days later, she received another letter stating that she was invited to the Archduke's palace, which surprised her even more. Along with the letter came a man named Aaron, who was the Archduke's knight and was ordered to escort the Archduchess, so he invited her into the carriage. Still in a state of shock, she headed towards the carriage, and the fact that she was actually getting married just wouldn't register in her mind. She didn't want to believe it. After all, he was the infamous Duke Diranta. After meeting him, it was clear. Only one fate awaited her. Necromantic fantasy is a world where true love does not exist. The protagonist of the novel is Archduke Sistine Diranta, who falls in love with Countess Yuri, but the lack of any desire for power from the aristocrat disappointed the young lady. Because of this, Lady Yuri left her fiancé and married the greedy Duke File, and then they joined the rebellion. Caught by the betrayal, the enraged Duke of Sistine killed Lady Yuri with his own hands and successfully suppressed the rebellion. Only at the end did the woman realize that what she held in her hands was not a sweet romance novel, but a horrible non-romantic fantasy, and the protagonist's story ended in a bloodbath. In the original, Rebel was just one of the side characters who died at his hands. She was killed for participating in the rebellion, but she also annoyed the Duke in another way. Surprisingly, she was caught spying on the Duke, and due to the Archduke's brutality, he ruthlessly killed her during the revolt. That's why she swore time and again that under no circumstances would she get involved with that man, hoping she wouldn't die like that. At least that was the plan, but now they had successfully arrived at the house of the very person she didn't want to meet, and from the threshold, she was greeted with a bow by the servants who called her Duchess. Finally, the woman was led to her new chambers. It was explained that the master would arrive soon and that she could rest until then. The heroine was noticeably surprised by her room and the mansion in general. There were lots of servants and luxurious furniture everywhere. Ultimately, this meant that she had truly fallen into the lion's den, or rather into the Archduke's family. But now she had to remain calm. They say you can survive anywhere, if you don't lose hope. Clearly there had been some mistake and they could break off the engagement soon. The owner of the house entered the room, and the heroine gave him a polite curtsy, although he said it wasn't necessary, since he was finally meeting his fiancé. Now they were getting to know each other. Despite everything, the lady remembered that, in the novel, Rebel described him as the epitome of imperial nobility, with luxurious light blonde hair, a calm and serene man with piercing blue eyes. For Rebel, she realised it was a very accurate description. He was truly very handsome, so it wouldn't be so bad if she just married him. But after a few seconds of sanity, she ordered herself to think clearly, so she addressed the aristocrat, suggesting that perhaps he had mistaken her for someone else. But he denied it, stating that she was definitely Lady Rebel and there could be no misunderstanding. So she decided to tell him about the article in the newspaper. This could mean the end of the Diranta line. But it turned out that no one supported him from the start, so there were no obstacles to the marriage. At one point, the man addressed Rebel directly and asked if she didn't want to become an archduchess, since she was the one who proposed. All that was left was to sign the official wedding invitation. That night, she had promised him that if they spent the night together, she would stay with him forever, no matter what, and would love him more than anyone. This statement left her noticeably shocked, as the heroine didn't understand what it was about or when she had made such a promise. The Duke became interested in why she looked so bewildered and informed her that she was the one who stole his virtue, that it was her initiative, and if proof was needed, he could provide it. That night she was at that strange bar, not at her house, and now she couldn't remember at all what had happened between her and this man, and it didn't seem like he was lying. But whatever had happened, she had no intention of just accepting it. The woman stated that if she became an archduchess, her hobby could damage the reputation of the Archduke's family. Suddenly the host grew grim and asked if it could harm the empire's prosperity, but the lady denied it. So she was allowed to do whatever she wanted, but he still wanted to know what it was. Perhaps it wouldn't affect the empire's security, but her hobby could negatively affect the Duke's prosperity, as it was also her job, since she was the one who wrote the article questioning the Duke's manhood. The heroine wrote that article not on a whim. If she didn't want to end up like in the novel, getting close to him was a bad decision, but still no one knew what might happen. One day she miscalculated the duration of her transformation and a man finally noticed her. And of all possible people, it was the editor-in-chief himself who discovered her. The man agreed to keep it a secret on the condition that Rebel show her sincerity, and a sensational article needed to be published. Rebel didn't understand why the article had to be sensational at all. If it were up to her, she would have written it a long time ago, but she already had a lot of good material. Many young women dreamed of marrying an archduke for love and power. There were those who desired the position of archduchess. Some claimed to have his child. Others swore they would take their own lives if they did not marry him. Then they became stars of many amusing cases, but the aristocrat publicly declared that he would never marry. So he would be the last archduke in his lineage. The man declared himself a perpetual bachelor, since if he died without marrying the family, Diranta would become extinct and its territory would pass to the imperial family. So the heroine became interested in these words. She sought the reason for this decision and began to investigate why one time she followed the aristocrat into a dark alley. He met with a suspicious person who, showing a small cart, claimed to have made great efforts to collect so much. Among the people, there were rumours about the magical properties of this herb, and everyone was crazy about finding it. The reporter recognised the raya herb. There she finally heard that due to its popularity, the plant was practically impossible to find. The aristocrat paid the man, and the heroine wondered why he was buying those herbs. If he was giving up marriage, then he was looking for a way to improve his potency. So when he claimed those were not his children, it meant that he was simply not in a condition to fulfill his conjugal duty to his wife, and he had no other option but to remain a bachelor forever. The editor-in-chief was very satisfied with the article, believing it would be a sure success, and then he agreed to ensure the secret would not be revealed and that the article would be placed on the front page. Finally, the news spread quickly among the people. The Archduke refused to marry, but at the same time, he was consuming the raya herbs. Everyone who had the chance talked about it, and later the article became a sensational success. And the reporter also became famous, and when she was going to the mansion, she was sure that the aristocrat would discover her, and she could in no way avoid her death. But at that moment, the man noticed that lately his mother had taken a liking to races between carriages and trains, so he supposed that their hobbies might coincide. Even so, he was very stubborn, so the lady had no excuses left, and for a moment she thought that maybe it would be better to pretend that everything was fine and simply marry him upon becoming an archduchess. She would live as she had always wished. But if the man discovered that she herself was the reporter, everything would change. Due to the amount of gossip that arose with the news, due to the fact that she tarnished not only his reputation, but also the reputation of the imperial family, she would be punished. Therefore, she now realized that marrying him was like condemning herself to death, so it was necessary to decide something immediately. The man saw her condition and decided not to ask any more about it, since if her hobby did not harm the empire, she had the right to choose any occupation and do whatever she wanted. However, the aristocrat had no intention of giving up their marriage since she was necessary to him. And if she did not mind becoming an archduchess, then he wanted her to stay with him as his duchess night fell. And with everything ready, all that remained was the official meeting of their families. And of course, the wedding ceremony. So the aristocrat proposed they go to the Empress's palace. The protagonist was surprised that they were suggesting to do it right now, since her dress was inappropriate. Although they assured her that his mother loved the vintage look, but in reality, it was quite worn out. But Sistine assured that she would be beautiful in any clothes, so she did not have to worry about anything. So they set off at the palace, and the protagonist blamed herself for having left things to the last minute, and she simply dragged herself after him. In the end, she could not cancel the engagement, and the meeting with the Dowager Empress only fanned the flames. It seemed that Rebel had gone completely crazy when the city started to talk about this article. Something strange happened. The editor-in-chief simply disappeared, and she was told that he had gone on vacation, and nobody knew when he would return, and his secretary could not say anything about it. In the end, the editor-in-chief never returned, and judging by that person's reaction, it seems that someone forced him to be silent, and this is probably somehow related to the Archduke. Later, the ruler was informed that the Archduke's carriage had arrived and Lady Rebel arrived with him, so they could finally meet her. Since the woman had for some time held a report on the investigation of the reporter Belle, they finally entered the imperial palace. And the protagonist could not shake the bad feeling that overcame her. She even began to think about escaping. While she still had the chance when asked if everything was okay, Rebel, in a not very convincing way, assured that she was just a little nervous since she had never met the Empress before, but the Duke kept insisting that there was nothing to worry about and that his mother was a very kind person. But in reality, she was fascinated by rather strange things like who would win a race, a train or a carriage, or how many people could fit in a single carriage. She wanted to know the limits of human capabilities, but when she got bored, she would simply leave, not wishing to see any of the people present in the experiment anymore, and their lives would then turn into a real hell. With the help of her intelligence, she found the traitors who were usually punished with death. But to entertain herself a little, she liked to invent punishments like leaving them adrift on the open sea. And if they survived, they would have earned their lives. Despite everything, the woman did not hold back when it came to punishments and, among other things, she ordered the lands where they rebelled to be turned into a wasteland. But upon seeing her son, she seemed very pleased. To her two sons, the woman always looked like a loving mother, but that only applied to her children Sistine, introduced the protagonist as his wife and future Archduchess Diranta, and she, of course, bowed politely before the ruler. The older woman noticed that Rebel's hands were trembling noticeably. She seemed very afraid that it would be known who she really was, so she decided to mock the protagonist a little. To see her reaction, a silence fell in the room, and the Duke's wife remained in a polite bow. Since no one had told her to stop doing so, suddenly she heard a voice telling her to raise her head, and she did so immediately, without realizing when it had happened. Then the older woman, with a terrible expression, noticed that the protagonist seemed to have a heavy head and that she could help her with that her neck would feel much lighter if she took some weight off like an extra head, but the son intervened and removed his mother's hand, explaining that Rebel was a little nervous and might not have understood that joke, so it would be better to avoid it. Since this was their first meeting, this intrigued the Empress, who commented that this girl seemed to be able to stir up Sistine. And she laughed out loud, the older woman assured that she was simply trying to lighten the mood. But it seemed that everything had come out the wrong way, and she apologized for it after these words. The mother hugged her future daughter-in-law, declaring that she could not express in words how happy she was to welcome the Archduchess. and that it was a great joy that Sistine had changed his mind, and that from now on, they would be delighted to have her here, just like Sistine. A little later, the Empress asked them for a moment to speak in private, and the son looked thoughtfully at his fiancé, whose eyes prayed for him not to go anywhere. But he finally left, and the women were left alone in the room, so it was time to have tea and chat a little. Meanwhile, she addressed the reporter Belle after a moment. The tea session began, and the ruler asked where she had gotten the information. The protagonist realized she had already been discovered, and she, trembling, pointed out that the editor-in-chief had mysteriously disappeared, and those thoughts arose on their own. It turned out to be true. And the Empress conducted an investigation after that article, so she was very surprised when she received a letter from her son in it. He indicated that the protagonist had made him a proposal, and although he had previously stated that he had no intention of marrying, the encounter with her made him change his mind, and if his mother and brother approve of the marriage, he wishes to welcome Rebel as Archduchess. After reading the article, the man was so angry that several chairs were ultimately missing from his mansion. And who knows if he would have wanted to get married if he had ultimately discovered who his fiancé really was. Now the question remained of what would happen to her. The lady was already preparing for different scenarios. They could simply execute her or feed her to the sharks. But death would undoubtedly be cruel. But suddenly the Empress declared that if she had already obtained approval, and he had met her now, it was necessary to arrange a meeting with her parents, then awaited the choice of the wedding dress and the ceremony venue, not the marriage itself, after which they would have a long and happy life together. But Rebel was too bewildered by this sudden decision, so she decided to clarify everything she asked. If even knowing who she really was, they wouldn't punish her, but instead would let her marry him. But it turned out that wasn't all. The older woman was ready not only to keep it all a secret, but also to reveal the truth about who the reporter's shoe really was. She was the same person who had written that despicable article about her, and she really wanted to know the identity of that person. But of course, under one condition, the Empress assured that there was nothing difficult about it, and if they obtained consent, she was promised protection from Sistine, even if he found out about it as expected. This proposal interested the protagonist, and she was asked to sit down, since this conversation would involve her son. Meanwhile, the maid approached the Duke, offering to take him to his room. But he intended to wait right there from the beginning. He had no intention of marrying. As long as his body was full of magic, there was a high risk that he would simply cause harm to his loved ones. Even without considering his circumstances, his brother still didn't take his eyes off him, even after ascending to the throne. And either way, he couldn't marry a girl from an influential family. That's why he took an oath to never marry, and the Duke had no intention of going back on his words. Until the moment of their meeting, the strange feeling that arose after meeting her became even stronger when they held hands. The magic that burned inside him that made others go crazy suddenly calmed down for the first time. So to get the man interested in marriage, she explained that she had a job that wouldn't make him lose his temper, that she wouldn't complain about money, and that they would respect each other's personal lives. This lady had a strange power that calmed his madness. Ultimately, he needed that power, so he agreed to her delight. Then Rebel took his hand and dragged him with her. Without explanation, then, she asked if he would tell her who he was, but she decided it would be better to introduce herself first. The future groom didn't understand how they had gotten to this point, so he claimed she was drunk and that it would be better to go back. But she didn't think so, since they were already married, and they didn't need to pretend it never happened. But Sistine was no longer thinking of backing out, so for the last time he asked her if she really wanted it to, which he received a confirmation, and at that very moment he kissed her. As is usually the case, the first wedding night passed quite quickly, when suddenly she mentioned Roland's name, thus surprising her current partner, but she also added that she would never forgive or forget him. And she meanwhile fell asleep with tears in her eyes. The dialogue between the Empress and the future Archduchess was already underway, and it was explained to the latter that her son never shows his feelings. Sistine didn't show joy or sadness and never wished to talk about what he wanted. He simply didn't express any desires, not even to his family, so she had to surrender to his coldness. This made her reflect. The man, of course, was not especially emotional and probably didn't even know how to show his feelings, but he still tried to do it. The Empress noticed that with Eronia, the situation seemed to be different if he is already sending her letters at dawn. But anyway, his mother approved of their marriage as soon as she found out. As soon as she found out, joy overcame her, since Sistine, for many years, had shown absolutely no desire for many years. She immediately remembered his childhood, where he spoke freely of what his heart desired. He cried and laughed and enjoyed life. That's why the Empress wanted to ask Rebel, whether it would be love tears or anger, and it was necessary to awaken Sistine's emotions. So that he could finally express them, this request truly frightened Ironia. Even though it all led to marriage, it was only one night. Maybe he said he wanted to marry her, but it wasn't about deep feelings, and how then could she melt his heart? It was impossible. Ironia withdrew her hand and began to declare that she was very grateful that the Empress would personally address her, a modest lady from a non-influential family. The reward was also tempting, and she felt bad about saddening the ruler the Empress didn't let her finish, and stated that no one was being denied, and it was better to say it directly instead of beating around the bush. Finally, she decided to tell the truth. Although she had proposed to Sistine in the end, she had no passionate feelings for him, and besides, she had no talent for evoking emotions in people. The mother reminded her that she had already achieved it before, so she shouldn't be so modest, since through her, the man had already broken several chairs, all because of a single article since then. Sistine showed some interest in the reporter Belle, and if she kept publishing such bold articles, the man would gradually begin to show emotions. Openly, Rebel pointed out that she might await the fate of those chairs, but the older woman cheerfully denied it, reminding her that she would protect her, and besides, if she refused now, she would later regret not marrying Sistine, which would allow her to escape the past of the noble lady whose father lost his fortune in gambling and bathe in opulence. And the Empress would personally announce the name of the one who would become Archduchess. Everyone without exception would find out about her, and Roland himself would be there. The ruler hoped that her future daughter-in-law would be smart enough to understand what it was all about. She would have time to reflect on how she wanted to get revenge. But the answer was expected to be heard right now. Therefore, she was asked one last time if Ironia would agree to comply with this request. Finally, the woman joyfully accepted. And then the Archduke appeared, to whom it was explained that a very cheerful conversation had taken place here. Now they needed to arrange a meeting with Viscount Yvella, and the man suddenly took a small envelope from his pocket, explaining that Rebel had personally given him the invitation 4 days ago, and it indicated a date that the heroine, of course, had no idea about. The mother unfolded the letter and read aloud that it was an invitation, cordially to the mansion of Viscount Yvella, in 4 days, signed with her name. The frightened heroine whispered, asking when she had had time to write that, and it turned out it was in a secret bar. Where she wrote the invitation on a check, the older woman decided not to pay attention to such formalities, since today was that very day, and therefore there was no need to wait but to go immediately. The fact that they were going to leave immediately surprised Rebel. She understood that the Viscount was probably fast asleep, and there was practically no human food in the house, and it seemed that in this family they didn't play around with decisions. The heroine proposed postponing the meeting for another day, explaining that they were not prepared to receive guests, and her father wasn't aware either. But still the Empress lightly assured that everything was fine, and that she knew something about the situation in that family. And yet this meeting would not be just a welcome, but rather a warning, since the lady would soon become part of the imperial family, and the Archduchess could not be allowed to live in such conditions. This was the best time to scold her father properly, so there was a chance to find his house in the worst state, since if she announced the visit, he would definitely hide the whole truth from them. Finally, these words made sense, and Rebel agreed that now was the right time, which meant that they were getting ready to leave. Upon opening the door for the woman, the Empress informed that they should show the Viscount that his daughter was no longer the same Rebel he knew, and to start they should change their clothes. The Viscount, meanwhile, had managed to wake up, and shouting that he was starving to death, burst into his daughter's room. But he did not find her there, which enraged him even more last night. The man saw Rebel being called before the Archduke. This answered the question of what she did at night. No one could have imagined that the lady enjoyed secret meetings with the Duke. This meant that they would now be linked to the imperial family, so they could live in opulence until the end of their days. And the man believed that the time had finally come to reap the rewards of his efforts. Suddenly the Viscount saw a carriage stop in front of the house from which Sistine emerged. Accompanied by Rebel, but behind him another carriage arrived, and from it this time emerged the Dowager Empress herself. He did not understand what was happening, but he knelt before the ruler anyway, declaring it was an honor for him to receive such guests. The Empress looked at the Viscount with disdain and walked past him demonstratively, declaring that her servant was well-dressed, but she was interested in Viscount Yvella. Later, they were invited to the table, where the older woman was surprised by their food, and when asked if they always ate like this, the host explained that more time than usual had been spent on the food today. This was another reason why they should celebrate the wedding as soon as possible, and the father, as soon as he heard about the wedding, perked up immediately. It was explained to him that soon there would be a wedding between his daughter and Sistine, and they came here to find out if he had any objections. but it turned out there was nothing of the sort. He simply was worried that his daughter was not worthy of the Archduke, but the Empress suddenly became grim, explaining that it was not Rebel he should worry about. Something troubled her, and it was precisely him, Viscount Rebel. The guest pointing at the host pointed out that this was precisely because he seemed to have bad hobbies, and she was referring to gambling. At that moment, Rebel intervened and began to beg her father to stop. After all, he was not only spending his daughter's money, but also the money they were supposed to spend on food. And now that Rebel was part of the imperial family, they could not stand by, and if the Viscount showed no will to change, they would simply force him. The goal was to achieve this, and the horrified man declared that he would not go near the casino anymore, and that he would give up gambling at that moment. The heroine truly understood the value of those words. Her father never listened to her, no matter how much she begged, but everything was resolved in an instant. And being an archduchess no longer seemed like such a bad decision. At the end of the conversation, Sistine assured that in this case, he would join the Order, and he was referring to the Order of Knights. In the original novel, the man was actually the commander of the Order of Knights. Rebel worried that he had not eaten anything, but he denied it, as he had eaten what the Viscount had served them, which scared the woman a little since the ingredients were at least 10 days old, but it seemed it was too late to talk about it finally. The time had come to act and win his heart, so the woman with a sweet smile suggested that he was still hungry and offered to bring him food, but was rejected. The Empress decided to support the heroine and began to persuade her son that it was a good idea and that he should be happy that his wife cared so much for him and they could chat during lunch, but he refused again. The man explained that he had just had lunch, so they could have lunch together at the Order, and if she wanted to talk to him, then the carriage would take her to lunch next. His mother began to get ready, who noted that perhaps he could have stayed, but matters awaited her in the end. The father promised to quit gambling, so Rebel thanked her for her help. On the other hand, the ruler pointed out that from now on, the heroine was the Archduchess of the Empire, and she needed to remember that Sistine's absence could not change that fact. She had to get used to the power, as no one else would look down on her turning around. The Empress pointed out that in a month, it would be the right time for the wedding, and the preparations would begin immediately, and they would announce the wedding today, as that would be more fun. This sudden news surprised Rebel greatly, as the news of her wedding to the Archduke was not yet public, and the wedding date had been decided recently, and the Empress wanted the article to be published today. Even though only the two of them knew the future, Archduchess explained that if she wrote the article today, she would easily give herself away to the people, to which they pointed out that they could assign the task to reporter Shu. Finally, they informed her that the report on the mysterious reporter was left in her room, so she had to make a decision. After reviewing it, and now was the time the task could be entrusted to reporter Shu. It sounded like a threat, but still they first had to find out who that reporter was. Upon returning home, her father was already waiting for her, who had not yet recovered from the sudden encounter, and fearfully pointed out that they needed to talk right now. The heroine asked if he wanted to discuss the gambling ban, and upon receiving confirmation, she simply walked past him as she had nothing to say. The man looked at her gravely, but at that moment he saw before him a look, similar to the look of the guest who had scared him, which led him to back down, returning to her room. Rebel's spirits were already lifted, as what had just happened meant it was time for her to get used to power, and that no one else would dare to look down on her. She cheerfully entered her room, where it was time to discover the true identity of the reporter, Shu. But what she saw was a shock. All of this seemed crazy, and these people never ceased to surprise her. As under the guise of the reporter was Lady Benica herself, it turned out they both had pseudonyms. Some published small gossip as reporter Melly, while the sensational stories belonged to reporter Shu, for the heroine. These seemed to be very unpleasant articles, so much so that they even needed a pseudonym for them, and such reporters tarnished the reputation of others. In the end, she did not want to read anymore when suddenly it was mentioned that she had unexpectedly declared herself single, which angered her noticeably, so the article was perceived as a challenge. An article was written, now from reporter Bell, that began with the words "mocking engagement," and then it said that after the unexpected engagement announcement between Lord Dillon and Lady Benica, rumours arose that Lady Rebel had secluded herself in the mansion. Distancing herself from the outside world, however, on the 6th day she appeared with a declaration that love is the blossoming of youth, so she will never give up on marriage, which caused a real stir in social circles. As a response to reporters Shu's articles, the heroine believed this could become a scandal, but still, she recognised that the interview itself meant little, but if words from someone more authoritative were added, however, a plan occurred to her, and she went to the person who was behind the door, from where a knight immediately came out kneeling before her. When they first met with the Empress, she explained that as an archduchess, she needed a knight to protect her, so she wanted to select a suitable one, and her choice was now in front of Rebel. He was a protector knight known as Shadow, and he was waiting for orders. The Archduchess informed him that she wished to take a short walk, so she would not refuse the escort, however. Shadow asked her not to address him so formally, since a mere knight was not worthy of such formalities from her. She was taken to the protocol department, where all the Empire's protocols were kept, and she could have never imagined she would come here for this reason. But in the end, she had a lunch appointment with the man, so she had to hurry and finish all her business as soon as possible. Suddenly, one of the employees caught her attention and immediately stated sharply that even nobles were forbidden to come here without permission, but her knight stopped him, asking him to show respect before the Archduchess. The employee claimed that the Archduke had not yet married her, but as soon as he saw an official permit in her hands, he was shocked and at the same time frightened the next moment. The employee was already bowing, apologizing for his rudeness, and interested in what had brought her here. Rebel explained that lately rumors had been circulating about her wedding, so she needed the help of the protocol department, and the man gladly agreed. She finally arrived in time for lunch, although the article was short, with an interview with the department employee and photographs. Now anyone would believe that her wedding was somehow related to the Empress's family. All that was left was to send it, when suddenly she was informed that her carriage had arrived, which surprised the lady, since if she wanted the article to be published today, she had to send it immediately to the press agency. But her situation was saved by the knight who offered to take the article to the agency, so she thanked him and asked him to make sure it was published immediately. The woman began to walk cheerfully towards the carriage when she suddenly realized what they had just told her, that it was her article, which meant that the Shadow knew she was a reporter. The carriage arrived directly at the fort, and the knights who were training nearby paid attention to it, since guests were not that frequent, but this carriage belonged to the Archduke's house. Smiling cheerfully, Rebel got out of the carriage, noting in her mind that she was not an ordinary visitor to them, since she was the Archduchess. But the knights around her started to get nervous, and some asked to bring the guest book. It seemed they had not been informed of her arrival. Suddenly an officer appeared and declared that the guest book was not necessary for the heroine. He introduced himself as the lieutenant of the commander-in-chief of Ether and was to guide her. As she walked through the inside of the fortress, the woman was surprised by its dimensions. She thought that if Sistine had invited her here, it would be as luxurious as his residence, but she was still interested in how delicious the food here would be. But her hopes were dashed when she arrived at the dining hall, where the knights waiting in line for food greeted her friendly. Behind her was Sistine, who explained that they would also have to wait in line, which gave her an unpleasant feeling. On today's menu, they had crab soup with chicken broth, an oriental dish, fried noodles with royal shrimp, and a western dish lobster with spices. The Archduke was happy that she had come here, so he hoped she would like the food, but the lady's reaction spoke for itself. She had never eaten such delicious dishes, so she asked to take some with her. Suddenly, the man became serious and stated that he wanted to discuss something, specifically their life together, since their union was a bit different from that of other noble couples. He couldn't promise a period where he would be constantly giving sweets and flowers, so he decided to apologize for talking about this only now. But the woman assured him that everything was fine and that he shouldn't worry. She understood that as an archduke he was very busy, and that they couldn't just stick to one another like newlyweds. In fact, she understood that it would be problematic if they were together all the time, since she probably couldn't continue working as a reporter. When he saw the heroine's cheerful face, he became visibly sad, stating that he was glad she liked it. But she immediately began to correct her statement. She meant that even as a couple, they needed personal space, as they couldn't limit one another, and Sistine agreed, since even when married, they should have a personal life. But the man also added that all this was an exception for their nights together. However, the heroine discreetly asked in response if they had them, and if he really planned to have them. But it turned out that he knew her story, and the fact that she wanted revenge on Roland, so they could use their marriage. As a form of revenge, Rebel contained her furious imagination and confirmed that she wanted revenge. But she didn't want to use her wedding for something like that, since Roland was now a thing of the past, and revenge against such a despicable person should not be more important than their future together. The Duke suddenly became serious again, thinking that she only accepted the proposal for that reason. Then the woman admitted that was the initial plan, but now that they were actually getting married, it was more important for her to live a happy and luxurious life with her man. That's why Rebel wanted to ask him not to forget one thing, that is not to use the word use anymore in relation to the wedding, as it was too cold a word for that. At that moment, the commander suddenly felt a bubbling magic inside him and decided to ask her, while taking her hand, to call him by his name. From that moment, some time passed and the heroine returned home, only she couldn't get it out of her head. The question of why he had suddenly asked her to call him by his name, and with a smile at that. But now she realized that the man was really smiling. Maybe he was finally showing emotions. Come to think of it, the Empress had informed her that before, when he was still a child, he laughed and cried a lot. The issue wasn't that Sistine didn't know how to express emotions, rather he suppressed them, and maybe there was some reason for that. Later, there was a knock on the door, a knight explaining that he brought a special edition of the evening paper. Her article had been published as an exclusive, and the newspaper was being distributed in the square and delivered to every house at that moment. This could mean that Benica must have seen this article, and all that was left was to wait for her response. Meanwhile, at the family residence of Alarock, the lady read the new newspaper with surprise, and it was clear that if the protocol department was involved, it couldn't be a lie. People reading this began to distrust the reporter, Shu, who not long ago had written that the lady had declared herself single, which could ruin his reputation. So it was necessary to retract it immediately. The next day, the heroine saw that on the front page of the new newspaper, there was an announcement, and considering how quickly it appeared, one could assume that Benica was somehow related to this, and this gladdened her heart. Suddenly, voices were heard from the street, voices asking if the article was a lie, and those people turned out to be journalists who were investigating her fiancé. The shadow noted that he only needed a few words to get rid of them right then and there, but the lady didn't take it seriously and suggested going to have breakfast and everything was fine, since the woman knew that if she didn't pay attention to them, they would leave on their own, so everything could be left as it was. But in reality, she realized that if she weren't the heroine of that article, right now she would be among them. Upon going to the kitchen, Rebel smelled a very pleasant aroma, and there was an unknown man who immediately informed her that today on the menu they had beef stew, salad and cornbread. He turned out to be the cook of the order, and she was very interested in where he had come from. The knight informed her that the Duke had sent him there early in the morning. Along with a letter in it, it was stated that at her request, he had sent his cook from the order, and from now on he would be her personal cook. But the lady did not remember when she could have asked for something like that, but it seems it was when she asked to take some food with her, and he misunderstood everything. Sitting at the table, the woman invited the knight to eat with her, but he refused, arguing that he had already had breakfast. But she didn't see why he couldn't break his fast, so pushing the food towards him, at which he stiffened, she tempted him to join her. Finally, the shadow gave in and agreed to join the lunch. Suddenly she realized that she hadn't even asked his name. All that was known about the knight was that he was close to the Empress and that he knew her secret, so in that case, she had nothing more to lose. The Archduchess asked directly what his name was, to which he coldly replied that it was number 109. Exactly, he proposed that they call him that. However, the heroine didn't want to believe it and took it as a joke, but she instantly realized that such people really existed. In the novel, the Empress's secret intelligence service was mentioned, which was called the Shadows. They were the Empress's close confidants who were assigned numbers instead of names, and since childhood, they were prepared to become an invisible protection for the Empress. Their main duties included espionage, surveillance, and of course executions. Their work was not as noble as that of the knights, but they devoted themselves completely to it. They all sincerely believed that only in that way could they repay the Empress for what she had given them under her protection, and now he explained that he was not a simple knight and that the ruler sent him, so the truth about the heroine's identity would not come to light. The lady was also interested if his mistress gave any other orders, and it turned out that she ordered him to watch over the Archduchess and ensure compliance. Successful completion of the task he had entrusted to her in all this, she was bothered by the word watch, as it was in fact espionage, and it turned out that as long as she didn't keep her promise, they would be watching her in that case. The woman suggested giving him a name. Since in public he couldn't be called by a number, as it would be strange, this surprised him, as he had never heard of shadows having a name. But if his lady wished it, he agreed with any name. She started looking for a word that sounded appropriate for his number and suggested 9. And from that moment on, they could get to know each other properly. Towards the afternoon, the journalists began to disperse. It seemed they finally understood that no one was going to come out to meet them. Then 9 asked if she had any plans for today, but she had nothing in mind. She was just going to stay home in that case. The protector suggested visiting the Archduke, but Rebel saw no need as they had seen each other yesterday. And besides, the journalist could be a nuisance putting his hand on his sword. The shadow noted that he could take care of them. And at that moment, the woman had a revelation. She asked directly if His Majesty ordered him to keep them close to Sistine. But the man turned away abruptly, thus confirming her words, so she accepted the proposal. Meanwhile, the Duke was reading a sensationalist article in which he was the protagonist. He didn't like it much, but as an aristocrat of the imperial family, he couldn't avoid it, and it would continue until the wedding. At that moment, he felt the magic coming from his wife, so he went to the door and opened it, and behind it was Rebel, who was about to knock. The woman asked if he knew she was coming, but he denied it and instead claimed he felt she was near. The heroine decided to start the conversation from afar, asking if she was bothering him. But he pointed out that he was just on a break, in which he was reading an exclusive edition of the newspaper. Rebel immediately recognized her article, which bewildered her. So she decided to find out if the man usually read newspapers. Sistine denied it, adding that he was very interested in the articles by reporter Bell, so they could read it together, taking the newspaper in his hands. The woman was ostensibly surprised that they had actually published such an article, and was even more surprised. When asked to give an interview, the man noted that he was an outstanding reporter, especially when it came to him. Rebel pointed out that her name was not mentioned in the article, so perhaps no one knew she was his fiancé. However, Sistine had another opinion. Even if it was considered that the protocol department was involved, Belle knew she was marrying the Archduke. It seems he was able to get the interview by mentioning his name. He managed to gather information about her and their imminent wedding, which meant the reporter was truly exceptional, and Rebel seemed to have met him, so the man wanted to know who that person was. The heroine panicked, so she said the first thing that came to her mind, as if she hadn't met him before, but still the fiancé insisted they had been together, and a brief summary would be enough for him. Now it was necessary to resolve something immediately, and first of all to calm down, since the Duke did not know that reporter Bell was her. It was necessary to change the subject somehow. Carefully, the woman began to say that, considering the nature of the profession, showing his face would be very reckless. So he came in cloaks finally. Sistine confirmed that could have really happened, so there was nothing to do about it, feeling a little relieved already, with a forced smile. The woman stated that now something else was important. She was interested if there was nothing wrong with giving the interview without his consent, but she received a calm confirmation. And at that moment, she realized it was the end for her. And anyway, it couldn't be helped since she allowed the article to be published. Without consulting the man with a sense of guilt, the woman stated that they had not yet announced the marriage, and she had already gone and given the interview. And although she didn't mention her name due to the department's intervention, suspicion fell on the Duke, and that's why she would like to apologize. Rebel had already prepared for the worst, but Sistine suddenly stood up and stated that it was not necessary to apologize, as she was not obliged to consult with him on all matters, and she shouldn't worry about his opinion and feelings at all. She could do whatever she wanted. At that moment, the woman, already in a cold tone, asked him to explain, which he did, saying that she could do whatever she wanted and not think about him. These words infuriated her, to which he recalled that he had already said she could use their marriage whenever she wanted, and therefore she shouldn't worry. And if he had already used his freedom, then she should do the same. But the last statement made her reflect. But how could she have been used? She had no wealth or influence since childhood, nor did she even have special skills. All she could offer was to keep him away from the annoying conversations about marriage. Only in that case could she be used, therefore. The woman stated that she didn't know what he had planned to use her for, but she wanted them to help each other from now on. They were a married couple, so they should help each other with the details, and not just that. But he kept insisting that they were just tools, one for the other. Rebel pointed out that it would be better to say they help each other. Simply substitute the word use with help. Besides, she had already asked him not to mention that word again, and now it all seemed as if he had lied. About being more careful, Sistine thought about this differently. She calmed his magic while he helped her with revenge. This marriage was based on mutual interests, and in similar relationships, it's better to draw certain lines. But Rebel rejected the revenge. She said that for her, it was more important to live happily with him, but they shouldn't hope, as they were not destined to be. The man stated that he had never lied to her, and if she didn't like that word, he would change it, and this time he would be careful in that case. The heroine assured that she would consult with him, to which he reminded her it wasn't necessary. But as soon as he saw her piercing gaze, he submissively agreed. Upon leaving the building, the woman realized that all her energy had left her, and when the shadow asked if she had a good time, she answered affirmatively. Despite the difficult conversations, everything had gone well. Rebel was so tired that she fell asleep in the carriage, when it suddenly stopped abruptly, and the lady got out to check what was wrong, and there she saw a carriage, a familiar one from which an old acquaintance came out. It was Viscount Roland himself, and they decided to let him pass, although she didn't understand if it was worth it to give way to her sworn enemy. But Nine, bowing, stated that he would do whatever she wished, and at that moment she realized she was an archduchess, and in that sense she was more important. But officially they had not yet announced the wedding, and the truth couldn't be revealed, but this was a matter of principle. Her former fiancé approached, and with a cheeky smile, stated that he was happy to see her, and she had no intention of giving in. Despite the difference in status, therefore, Rebel stated that she was not at all happy about it, and just seeing him made her want to vomit in response. He pointed out that there was no point in being embarrassed. Now he understood that she was sad because everything had gone wrong. But he didn't even imagine that the lady would take his joke so seriously, since they were in a relationship with no strings attached. So she didn't need to be so stubborn. His touch was the boiling point, so she stopped holding back in her comments. With a sarcastic tone, she stated that she had not even thought that his day and night visits meant a relationship with no strings attached, and she was intrigued as to how people who wanted to get married should behave. Or maybe secretly from others in the drawing room, Roland immediately declared with fear that he didn't understand what it was about. But at that moment, the shadow drew his sword and pointed it at the man, indicating that he should not get any closer instantly. Benica also got out of the carriage, and upon seeing her, the heroine realized with disgust that she was having a bad day. As everyone she couldn't stand had gathered, Roland asked her to stay in the carriage, but she, bewildered, stated that it was better to give way to them, which surprised the man, but he finally agreed, giving his fiancé a kiss. After that, he went back to talk to Rebel, who was already bored with him, and stated that for Benica's sake, he would yield today. However, Roland wanted to ask something about her wedding specifically. If she took another man's joke seriously, as his empty talk had caused him a lot of trouble, and he feared there would be another victim of misunderstandings upon hearing this. Benica understood something, but she was not given the chance to speak instead. The heroine declared that she had no reason to worry, as the protocol department had confirmed their wedding. The man remained silent, and his future wife felt embarrassed. It seemed he had never heard of it, which meant he hadn't read her article, he had only heard rumours. A frightened Benica quietly returned to the carriage. And if he had read that article, then everything was clear with that their conversation ended and they continued on their way. Finally, the lady managed to maintain her pride and also see their twisted faces, but she still felt bad, probably because of that kiss. For a brief moment, she managed to see them in the passing carriage. It was her former partner, and just 1 week ago, that was her place. Rebel didn't doubt for a second her happy future with Roland. She thought she would be sitting next to him in the carriage and dancing at the ball for the rest of her life. But now he would be dancing with Benica in the end. She couldn't have foreseen something like this, but now there was no turning back, and there was no point in regretting it anymore. The most important thing now was that her rose-coloured glasses fell from her nose, and she realised how pathetic Roland was besides. She had met someone who was 1,000 times better than him. Of course, it takes time to get closer to that wonderful person. But there was plenty of time, so she was bound to be happy enough to forget Roland forever. Upon returning, the woman sighed loudly and then noted that she should have said some things to his face. And she regretted not having done it, but Nine approached from behind in a low voice and stated that he could do it. She just had to give him the order, still the lady realised she had to watch her words in front of him, because if she joked in the wrong way, the shadow might bring her an enemy's head. But she had no intention of leaving things as they were. Especially after how he had acted towards her, Rebel would get her revenge differently. There was a sure way to weaken Roland, and it was what she was good at in both her past and current life. Exposing the Dillon family's corruption, the heroine began to prepare for the job. She took the appropriate clothes, the camera, the notebook and the pen. And when everything was ready, she was finally prepared. Looking in the mirror, she wondered if she had forgotten anything. And suddenly she realised she had forgotten the most important part, the transformation. When she was transported to this world, she already knew the local language and knew how to transform for a person in her profession. A better skill could not be found. Suddenly, Nine knocked on the door asking if everything was ready, and at that moment, she realised she didn't know how to explain it to him. The man, of course, knew she was the reporter Belle, but it was unknown if he was aware of her abilities, but the shadow himself noticed that he heard a voice. Unknown, so he started knocking harder, trying to call the lady, but no one answered. While the heroine was thinking about what to do and whether to cancel the transformation, Nine understood that if she didn't answer, it meant something had happened. So without thinking, he broke down the door. The unknown woman in front of him called him by his name in fear, and the man already knew that only one person called him that, so he understood she had transformed. Understanding the situation, the guard pretended that nothing extraordinary had happened and simply asked her what her plan was for today. The reporter intended to first visit the Dillon estate to investigate the workers. They weren't ordinary workers. Roland called them that. She used to visit the estate frequently when she was still with him, and there she would see how suspicious people approached him. They interacted with him often and mainly. All their conversations were about money. They often bothered the merchants, stealing money in front of the owner of those lands. But when the heroine asked Roland who they were, he would call them his workers without explaining anything properly, which meant they didn't work there in the literal sense of the word at that time. The lady didn't notice anything suspicious. Because love blinded her, but it was all about money, those workers seemed more like simple bandits, and Roland was somehow linked to them, which was very suspicious. She could smell corruption from miles away, so she intended to infiltrate their ranks and meet those same workers. The guard was noticeably surprised that she, being an archduchess, planned to do it personally, and she seemed to believe in her success, and that no one but her could handle it. 9 could only accept the lady's wish, and declare that the shadows would be discreet, and those last words puzzled her a bit after a brief gesture. 5 other people appeared in the room who greeted the heroine in chorus, and it turned out they had been there. Since the day the Empress visited that place, the woman didn't understand why there were so many people there, since 9 was enough, but he reported that in Dylan's vast possessions, he couldn't handle it alone. Besides, he would have to drive the cart finally. He asked for understanding on the matter, as His Majesty ordered to ensure her complete safety. Since she was an archduchess in the end, she had no choice but to accept their help. They assured her that she didn't have to worry about camouflage. Literally in an instant, each of them disguised themselves in common clothes, and 9 explained that they weren't as skilled at it as Rebel. But they also knew a thing or two. They also handed her a bag. It was a gift from the Emperor so she could perform her tasks better. It was like a work expense, and he also told her that he would eagerly wait. For her next article, the woman felt some pressure, but if she already had so much money, then the plan could be adjusted a bit, and even improved. So they headed to that market in Dylan's possessions, where the heroine posed as a simple merchant, and the other shadows couldn't believe it, as it was the first time in their career that an aristocrat, and moreover a member of the imperial family, became a merchant.